Oh, there it is. So again, we at the 9 Mile Creek Watershed District, we have grants available for these sorts of projects that will be talked about in the presentation, as well as a few others, including salt reduction, which is important in the winter time to make sure that we use just the right amount of salt and not too much, as well as keeping people safe. So that webpage is 9milecreek.org/grants, which will be coming through the chat. And then I also just want to mention the Adopt a Drain program, which is not 9 Mile specific or Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek specific. It's throughout the whole state of Minnesota. Wherever you are, you can adopt a drain and keep it clean. And that is a really good way of socially distancing, since we maybe still need to do that. And then also just keeping your streets clean as well, and preventing all of that debris from going to our lakes and creeks. So I'm going to turn it over to Eleanor for a little bit about their watershed.
Awesome. Thanks, Gail. My name is Eleanor. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District next door to 9 Mile. We are local government established in 1969. Our mission is to protect, manage, and restore our water resources. We also cover about 50 square miles, and we cover this 3 creeks of our name, Riley, Purgatory, and Bluff Creek. And that goes over 7 cities: Bloomington, Chanhassen, Chaska, Deep Haven, Eden Prairie, Minnetonka, and Shorewood, and covers 2 counties, Hennepin and Carver County. We partner with our local communities to protect our water resources and prioritize projects that address these issues that we're facing with our water resources. Another program that we have very similar to 9 Mile is our Watershed Stewardship Grant Program. So we offer up to $5,000 for homeowners to install clean water projects on their property, such as rain gardens, native plant buffers, wetland restorations, rainwater reuse systems, erosion control, or tree trenches. We fund projects that both have quantifiable benefits to water quality, habitat, or flood reduction, and also support our 10-year plan. So projects that have a greater benefit to water quality and those that achieve multiple district goals can get a higher funding percentage. So these are cost share grants, so we can provide up to 75% of the project cost. And you can learn more about this at rpbcwd.org/grants, which was just dropped in the chat, and then can reach out to me or our grant coordinator, Liz, if you have any questions. Maybe we'll throw her email in there as well. Our grant program is closed for the season, but it will reopen in the spring. So you can get your application prepped and ready to go if you have a project in mind, and then you can apply for it as soon as that reopens in the spring.
All right, I'll pick up from Eleanor. I'm Christine Peterson from the city of Minnetonka, where I am the Natural Resources Engagement Coordinator. And I wanted to point you to some resources in case you are a Minnetonka resident, or even if you're not. We have some good reading material that Alyssa will put in the chat. One of those links will take you to the Natural Resources homepage that you can use to find contacts, like for myself or Matt, who I'll introduce here in a minute. You can find events. Perhaps you were on our events page to register for this workshop, but also some resources about things that residents can do, things the city does. And you can subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter that always has an article and often information about grant opportunities and workshops and things like that. The other link that Alyssa will pop up is for the Minnetonka Memo, which is the print newsletter that comes to all Minnetonka residents. But again, it has some good information that even if you don't live in Minnetonka, you might find useful. And our goal in holding these workshops every year and working with partners like Gail and Eleanor and their watershed districts is to help residents in Minnetonka and beyond learn how to plant for pollinators, to plant for resilience, to plant for stormwater control, and a variety of other priorities that are part of our work in natural resources, because most of the natural areas in Minnetonka are on private property. So what you do on your property makes as big a difference or more than what we do on city property. So with that, I'll pass it over to Matt Kumka, who's our Parks and Trails project manager, and he's going to give you a great presentation. Thanks again for coming tonight.
Thanks so much, Christine. Good to see everybody, digitally at least, tonight. My name is Matt Kumka. I work for the city of Minnetonka. I've been here for about a year now. But prior to coming over to the city, for the longest time, about 14 years, I worked for a company called Bar Engineering. And I was lucky enough to work with a lot of the local watershed districts, honing my craft and learning a lot about green infrastructure, specifically things like rain gardens and shoreline buffers and other more technical BMPs, what we'd call best management practices, and developing ways where we can intervene in the landscape and sort of improve water quality as much as we possibly can with things that we do in the landscape. So what I'm going to showcase tonight through my presentation is a bit of a background, why we do these things, what some of the major issues are that cause some of the problems that we're attempting to solve with features like rain gardens or shoreline buffers. Then I'll get into some high-level nuts and bolts of how these features work, with a bit of a focus on plant selection, some focus on what we need to do to the soils to maintain soil health to make sure these features function. And finally, wrap it up with some plant selections and ideas on maintenance and ways to monitor your feature if you were considering these. Just try to sort of boil it down to actionable concepts that you can sort of wrap your brain around why and how to make these things work on your particular residential properties. So with that said, I'd like to keep this conversational. The chats will pop up. I saw that already. So we've discussed bringing in questions during as necessary or saving all your questions for afterwards. I'd be happy to have a conversation with everybody interested afterwards and talk all these concepts through. So I'm going to go ahead and make an attempt to share my screen over here. So you should be seeing the cover of my slideshow here. So
Yep,
rain
that's working,
gardens
yeah.
and thank you so much. Shoreline buffers, landscaping for water quality. What you're seeing on this cover image here was a big stormwater retrofit project that I helped work on up in Maplewood at the Maplewood Mall. We had a series of rain gardens to intercept stormwater off the parking lot of this particular mall. This represents a very engineered, very expensive stormwater quality project. But what I'm going to showcase tonight is much more humble and much more doable in your yard. But with that said, I want to talk a little bit about how we got to this issue. So what have we built generally in the landscape? So we develop our roads and our housing. We develop our landscapes in a way, there's this concept in landscape architecture called prospect and refuge, where we like to look across the landscape. We like to have clusters of trees. We like to have clusters of shrubs. But we also like a savanna-like situation often, and what that translates to is a lot of turf grass. And we've developed a landscape that requires a particular sort of management technique, often described as mow, blow, and go. So we're mowing the turf grass, we're blowing the leaves up or the grass clippings off the driveways and the roads, and then we're getting it out of there as fast as possible. We've sort of industrialized the landscape management process. I like to quote George Carlin, a bit of a cheeky quote here: mile after mile, mall after mall, many, many malls, major malls and mini malls. They put the mini malls in between the major malls, and in between the major malls, they put the mini marts. And in between the mini marts, you got the car lots, gas stations, muffler shops, laundromats, cheap hotels, fast food joints, cemeteries, and golf courses. America the Beautiful, one big transcontinental commercial disaster. It's a bit negative, I will admit that. But what this hints at, and I think is really the source of a lot of our problem here, is that we've built landscapes primarily for the automobile. We need commercial infrastructure, obviously. We need to be able to move through the landscape quickly and efficiently. But what this does, it creates particular problems when it comes to stormwater quality and the amount of runoff that we're producing from these particular impervious surfaces that we're forced to create on the landscape to be able to move via automobiles across them. So what you're seeing here is a bit of an oil sheen coming across a parking lot, pretty common sight. You also see these leaves collected around this catch basin here, which is a bit of an increasing problem, which I'll describe a little bit more in detail. And what the engineering solution to this problem was traditionally is to create ponds like the ones you see here. Now these are nice and neat, they're easy to maintain, they're very clean, but they don't do much for habitat. This doesn't necessarily support pollinating species or even aquatic species. There's no spots for a turtle or a frog to come up and go through their life cycle on the shoreline of these particular features. But they are engineered to collect the storm water that runs off our impervious surfaces and stack it all in one location and whisk it away as quickly as possible. So we developed our infrastructure to treat water as a waste product. So we're forced to put it in increasingly large pipes and move it away for safety reasons from our roads and our infrastructure, so we can all live there safely. It's a necessity that we've created for ourselves. But what you end up getting is too much water too quickly. So for instance, this urbanized stream here, you're seeing very severe bank erosion occurring here. You're seeing turf grass right up to the stream's edge. And what ends up happening during even a small rain event is you get what's called bounce. And that would be the stream rising very rapidly, flowing very quickly, not a whole lot of vegetation on the banks at all to hold it. And then you get a lot of erosion occurring. You're getting these banks sloughing off into the water and being carried away by the quick currents. One engineered solution is to armor those banks as much as we possibly need to. So what you see here is riprap along the shoreline of this particular lake. What we're doing is we're concentrating water in less and less locations over the landscape, and that brings with it a bunch of problems. Primarily, not only the volume of water, but the water itself carries nutrients with it. So these are things like crushed up leaves on the asphalt or other nutrients, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus that comes off the landscape, and they accumulate in natural water bodies. So what we end up getting are algae blooms across our local water bodies that are becoming more and more increasingly common. Fortunately, we still have this natural model to apply on the landscape, and we can make some landscaping decisions based on what Mother Nature has shown us works in the past. So the image in the upper left is a pothole prairie. This was a common distribution of wetlands, but as we've turned that sort of landscape into farm fields or suburbia or even a city, we're forced to remove those wetlands, concentrate the water in certain places. We also reduce plant diversity with our need to be able to manage the landscape very quickly and efficiently. And by losing plant diversity, we lost out on a lot of soil building and carbon capture that we get through native plants and their deep roots that hold all those nutrients in the soil. So nature also performs an inspiration for us in terms of what we should expect from how much water we need to capture on the landscape. So for instance, in the Minnesota River Basin, 40% of the rainfall that would fall would be absorbed by the ground and eventually evapotranspired from the plants. So that means the plants are sucking up that water out of the soil and releasing it as water vapor through their leaves and foliage. About half that water would infiltrate into the existing subsoils, and only about 10% of that runoff would be let off the landscape as runoff. Now, those percentages are way different on an asphalt pavement parking lot, as you can imagine. So this concept of green infrastructure tries to solve that as much as it possibly can. So this is sort of an engineering approach that looks at the economic, the social, and the environmental issues in our designs on the landscape. Not only engineering, but planning and landscape architectural design. All attempts to potentially taken these natural models of Mother Nature via this green infrastructure approach. And to do that, we're looking at combining a series of needs. So needs for the planet, needs for the economy to continue to function. We need to be realistic in terms of who's using these landscapes and what we need them for. But while doing that, we can improve community health. We can reduce our energy use in terms of where we put trees by our houses to cool those windows. We can increase the livability of our communities. We can take the load off our existing infrastructure to some degree. We can create more reliable and maintainable infrastructure if we're designing in a certain way that takes the load off the pipes and the existing infrastructure we have in place. And we can improve economic development via a more beautiful place to live in, as well as enhancing water quality. So we need to view the landscape holistically. We need to look beyond just sustainable. Frankly, we need to move towards a more regenerative approach to landscaping design. This is one where we are restoring natural systems back into the landscape, where we are considering things like steep slopes and waterways, wetlands. We're applying the economic and the social and cultural needs like vegetation and farmsteads and housing. And we are looking at the landscape holistically in a sort of composite view. So tonight I want to look through three sort of approaches where we can balance the human use in the landscape and talk a little bit about what a landscape design for water quality might look like. Specifically what I'm calling infiltration features, or otherwise known as rain garden first. So this is a picture of a rain garden that I designed in Bloomington a few years ago. Rain gardens 15, 20 years ago were a pretty radical concept. This idea that you wouldn't just put the stormwater into a pipe and put it under the street, but you'd actually collect it in somebody's front yard. What you see here is the water before it's able to enter that catch basin, move into this shallow depression that's planted and I like to think kind of beautiful, and take that water in, and the nutrients that would normally move downstream are absorbed into the soil there, and we're doing passive irrigation. With the plants we're choosing, we're doing some pollinator benefit. So we've come a long way in terms of making these things more visible and more acceptable overall in the suburban landscape. So that's a good thing. We've come a long way through the hard work of a lot of educators and a lot of successful projects out there, that things like rain gardens are sort of a public term now and gets folks in the door like you here for our workshop tonight. So placement, where are we looking to put these things? We're putting them wherever they can accept water from the street, frankly. Ideally, space is available for these sort of things, but you're going to want to think closely about where they potentially go on your landscape, and I'll talk through some particulars on that. Roof water is great to collect in a rain garden, but keep in mind that it is relatively clean compared to the water that comes from our streets or our driveways. Think about it this way. So we have to replace the brakes on our cars every few years. Well, the metals in those brake pads go somewhere as the brakes grind down over time. Same with our tires. Our tires go from having deep treads to having less and less treads. All that rubber and all that material goes somewhere. It goes into our streets, and then it eventually gets washed away as runoff. So water from streets and driveways is increasingly dirty compared to that comes off our impervious surface that's generated through our roofs and other sidewalks. So we like to position these features adjacent to streets and driveways as much as we possibly can. We realize this can be a challenge, certainly for a typical homeowner, but a lot of the references that were already pointed out tonight, the cost share programs from the watershed districts highlight some approaches to potentially do this. And you're seeing more and more residential landscapes take on projects like these where they're able to accept water from the street or their own driveway and push it into a rain garden. These projects you see here with the circles on the sidewalk, that's also up in Maplewood. That's a Living Streets project, it's called. We actually narrowed the street there and worked with all the homeowners in the project area to what we call host the rain gardens. So essentially become stewards for the rain gardens and maintain them in perpetuity. And we were able to get a couple dozen rain gardens as part of that project in. So in the backyard, often I hear folks say, well, I have a wet spot in the backyard already. It would be a really great spot for a rain garden. This isn't necessarily true often. What we're trying to do is intercept that polluted runoff and put it in the ground rather than just form a deeper depression in an already wet spot. So although they may be beautiful and offer an opportunity to sort of correct a wet spot in your yard, it's not always ideal to put a rain garden or an infiltration feature in a spot that's already wet. It would be certainly less cost effective in terms of the water quality benefits you'd be getting from it. So with all this in mind, you got to keep in mind that there are a lot of utilities under the ground. So we have cable and gas and drinkable water coming into your house and store water coming out of your house. And that causes a lot of conflicts, especially in a traditional suburban front yard. So certainly you'll need to keep in mind when you're thinking through where a rain garden might go. Also, you need to think about your existing subsoil. So we're looking to temporarily pond water in these basins, and then the basin is going to infiltrate that water into the ground, leading to a lot of positive benefits. But unfortunately, we don't have good native subsoil across the metro to support this sort of landscape design. So we have to think very cautiously about where we site these and what we might need to do to amend the subsoils to promote this type of infiltration. This is sort of your typical construction site where a lot of our homes were built. What happens is we end up crushing the soil quite a bit to construct our homes in a very efficient, quick way. So what you see here is what happens. A lot of the quality soil would be stripped off the site and stockpiled. Then the construction takes place. There's a lot of compaction occurring. And you end up with a very destroyed soil profile that doesn't have a lot of the water carrying capacity or the fungal networks required to support plant life or certainly promote stormwater infiltration. So this compacted soil is often void of valuable micronutrients and funguses, and it limits that infiltration and limits the amount of plant growth you're going to see. So unfortunate reality in a lot of the landscapes and our home sites where we live. And poor soil equals a poor rain garden or infiltration feature. I can't stress this enough. It's really something we need to be able to think through when we're considering a rain garden. We're not always able to dig test pits, but it's a good idea to get your hands dirty and sort of understand what you have in terms of subsoil. This was a spot where we were looking at a potential rain garden in this boulevard, and we did some digging first. So a good idea to understand what you're getting into. Here's an example of a rain garden that we were building down in Egan. And what you see here is a tiny sliver of healthy soil, the dark stuff. And you see some roots coming out of a nearby tree, but the subsoils here are very densely compacted, silty clay soils, not very good for infiltration at all. So traditional suburban lawn supported by irrigation and a lot of fertilizing looks perfectly green, but the subsoils underneath are not conducive to infiltration and are less conducive to healthy plant growth. So some soil amendments would be needed for that, and I'll touch on that in a bit. And in an urban landscape, you need to be able to brace yourself for surprises. So what you're seeing here is each one of those black layers is a layer of asphalt. And this ended up being a street side location where the street kept subsiding. And all they would do, it was a former wetland site, And what they would do is they would bring in additional soil and then lay another layer of asphalt on top of that. So these sort of workaround engineering solutions happen all over the landscape. When I lived in Minneapolis, we were digging for a rain garden and found that it was a former dump site where somebody was burning trash. Very common. You'll see paint cans and all sorts of debris. So we're going to want to be really careful and cautious to avoid those sort of things. Where we're dealing with subsoils that are less than permeable, there is an option to perform what's called soil correction, which in this little diagram, you're seeing the above image, the water is able to collect in the rain garden or infiltration basin and infiltrate into the ground. The lower one, let's say that soil is impermeable or less conducive to infiltration. What you could do is create an additional excavation and backfill that with sand or some other sort of permeable material to get down into a more permeable soil. So those examples I showed of the construction site where the soil might be very compacted on the surface, you could potentially remediate that soil and create sort of a lifeline to the permeable soil beneath. And a third option would be if you just can't get down into permeable soils, you would be able to install a filtration system. So that blue and white circle that you see in the bottom, that would be a drain tile that would be able to collect the stormwater as it filtered down through the soil and past the plants, some of it infiltrating off to the sides, but some of it able to escape out of this drain tile that would be drained in another location downslope somewhere. I want to get into what I'm calling thoughtful planting. So there's a lot of important strategies in terms of choosing plants and designing both rain gardens, infiltration features, and shoreline buffers that I'd like to point out. And I have some examples from nature to highlight do's and do not do's. So what we're doing is we're sort of creating a very unique extreme condition, one that we're accepting rainwater off an impervious surface, often filled with sediments and other debris. And we're creating a situation where we want the soils to be permeable enough that the water is able to move beneath the surface. So we're creating a very extreme condition for plants to grow. And the thought is often what kills plants in rain gardens are wet and soggy conditions. And if done correctly, the rain garden should be typically fairly dry. So what you're ending up killing plants is drought-like conditions. So that would lead us to plan for species that can tolerate drought conditions as much as they can tolerate occasional inundation in the bottom of the garden. And I'll walk through some examples of those types of plants. So really what we're doing is we're creating this necessity for lean soils to allow that infiltration to occur. So this rain garden here under construction, you can see the planting soil that was put in just prior to planting is fairly light in color. It's not incredibly full of compost material like your vegetable garden would be, but we're creating a situation where the water can pool and then infiltrate rather quickly. Plants are very critical for infiltration. A lot of the native plants that I'll showcase in this presentation, like I mentioned, have very deep roots. They have very robust root networks. Often what happens is these plants put down a lot of roots, and then over the winter, a lot of those roots will do what's called sloughing, and they'll die away and create essentially pathways for the water to move down, and they'll put on new roots the same way they put on new vegetation at the surface. And that process continues, bringing in carbon and storing it beneath the ground, but then also loosening the soil as we go. So plants are very critical for infiltration and the health of a shoreline buffer or a rain garden. So as I mentioned, we need plants that can tolerate both the wet condition when the rainfall enters the garden and then dry conditions that we produce with these leaner soils and just the nature of the infiltration itself. So a little primer on plant choice. So I want to touch on this. There's a lot of amazing value to native plants. I think this goes without saying. The value in terms of pollinator species support, their beauty, choosing plants that were traditionally in this area and helping them reestablish, and all the interesting, botany that goes along with that. But with that said, there are a lot of non-native species available and what we call cultivars, which are essentially blends or selected varieties of native plants. These might be the right choice if the garden or feature is going to get very little maintenance. These non-native plants are designed to have long blooms and not require a lot of input often. So there are select non-natives where I would support the inclusion of them in the right situation. They call them native, or they call them wildflowers for a reason. They want to be able to move around. So you need to consider some of those features of native plants when you're choosing your plants overall. So absolutely would push everybody to plant natives exclusively, but there are occasions when non-natives might be the aesthetic choice of a particular homeowner, or where maintenance is going to be potentially quite limited, as native plants sometimes have a shorter lifespan, or require a bit of natural movement as they put their seed down on the ground, and are able to move around a little more. So just a consideration, I would fully support natives only, but occasionally in these basins, you're going to see non-natives. So I want to talk a little bit about shoreline buffers and what it looks like from nature's example. So what you're seeing here is tamarack bog up north. So it's fairly uniform. What you're seeing is essentially a large sedge or grass meadow with a handful of trees. You're seeing, again, sort of a uniformity to this particular plant community. What you're also seeing here is that this plant community is able to move from the wetter area to the left and climb up this road bank. So this is, the species you're seeing here is prairie cordgrass, and I'll highlight that later. But this is an example of a natural plant, a native plant that's able to sort of bridge the gap and is tough enough to survive in the wetland area, but also climb up this road bank here. So it's sort of a neat example of nature and plants being able to thrive in a variety of situations. I would also point out floodplain forests are also a location where there's seasonal inundation potentially in some years, and then there's periods where it's exceedingly dry and sandy. That would also be a local native ecosystem that we might be able to look to in terms of inspiration for choosing some plant species. So I want to walk through a shoreline buffer planting experience and highlight some interesting findings that we found. So when this project was started way back in 2002, this is the Lakewood Cemetery Shoreline Buffer Project in Minneapolis. Beautiful cemetery. They were, for the longest time, mowing their turf grass right up to the shoreline. So what you see here is nice and neat failing edge along this pond buffer. Local stormwater did enter this pond. You can see some purple loosestrife thriving along the shoreline there. And the cemetery contacted the engineering firm I worked for and said, we would like to do a native buffer. Great. It was a relatively new idea in 2002, not relatively new, but new to this sort of organization looking to do this sort of thing, because there was a neatness concern. Is it going to look like weeds, etc.? But they wanted to move ahead anyway, and they said, we want diversity. We want a beautiful natural buffer full of all the species that would potentially be along a buffer. So 58% forbs, a bunch of graminoids, that would be sedges and grasses, 64 total species, essentially the litany of species that would potentially thrive in a situation like this. Everything went swimmingly. 2005, a couple of years after planting, everything's thriving. You see some cardinal flower, you see various grasses and sedges, some what I think is bone set in the back, traditional shoreline buffer species. Everything's thriving, crazy diversity, various bloom times throughout the season. And this persisted for a few years. You got what looks like some coneflower in there, some iris along the shoreline. You have some marsh marigold blooming in early spring. And slowly but steadily, what happened was monoculture formed. So there was one particular species, in this case, it was lake sedge, a taller native sedge, very tough. It thrived in this particular situation. It was able to find its niche along this shoreline, which was planted with tons of diversity, but without steady input of protecting that diversity and reinforcing it, and maybe even knocking back the lake sedge just liked it enough that it was able to thrive and take over. There's nothing wrong with this. This is performing all the functions we would potentially want out of a shoreline buffer in terms of water quality. It's stabilizing the shoreline. It's doesn't require a whole lot of weeding at all. It's hard for weeds to get started in something so thick. But it wasn't what the client at the time was hoping for. They wanted tons of diversity, but without a lot of intervention, this one particular species found its spot and was perfectly happy. And we really shouldn't have been surprised by this. This is typically the way shoreline buffers establish themselves. There are particular wetness regimes that they want to thrive in, and they will. So traditionally along a wetland edge, if it's not actively maintained, of course there's going to be diversity, but there's going to be a handful of species that really thrive in that particular location. So those are the ones that we're going to really want to lean into. So briefly, I want to hit on this, a bit of a wordy slide here, but maintenance can really be performed through good planting practices. So this would be things like thoroughly preparing the soil in advance of a rain garden or a shoreline buffer, completely eradicating any turf or unwanted plants prior to any planting or soil work that you'd be doing. You want to obviously pick plants that are right for the sun or the shade condition that you're going to be seeing in your particular project location. You're going to want to space plants out for their full size. And I'll show that through some planting examples here in a minute. But you're going to want to plant for the spacing them such that when the garden's full, there's no empty space between the plants. You're also going to want to mix species for the ground and potentially woody shrubs and or trees to fill that space above. So really layering the plant community like a natural ecosystem. Often we're going to suggest that you would mulch heavily. You would mulch right off the bat, and you would maintain a mulch depth through the life of this particular feature, shoreline buffer or rain garden. Mulches help maintain soil moisture and thus help the plants. They also promote fungal growth, which is very important for the plant species to thrive. But key in terms of maintenance is they protect the soil from weeds being able to get germinated to get it started. And then obviously timely, proactive weeding throughout the growing season. You're going to want to target the particular aggressive species that might be around your area. This is often weed trees or undesirable trees or things like thistle. And then just being very thoughtful in terms of not letting weeds go to seed. There's a whole host and lots of resources you can find in terms of which seeds or weeds to actively watch out for. So I won't go into that here, but if you're able to be very proactive and timely about weeding, keeping the gardens looking good is a fairly simple task. So I want to show some lifespan gardens over the years as they've sort of matured over time. So this was a very somewhat famous case of rain gardens down in Burnsville, very suburban, as you can see. This was immediately after planting. So these were containerized plants. You can see a bit of a limestone retaining wall there to protect that birch tree. And then several years later, you can see the plants at maturity. This is a mix of non-natives, so obviously things like that white hydrangea in the background, things like Carl Forrester, which is a feather reed grass, a decorative grass that's very long-lived, and then some natives mixed in there too, I believe. And then over time, you know, a lot of these non-natives will continue to thrive. Some of the natives may have puttered away, but many years later, you still see the non-natives in here, like daylilies, for instance, or some of the black-eyed Susan cultivars you'll see. So this would be an example of a non-native garden in a very suburban yard. Here's another example where the garden somewhat sparse early on. You'll see some autumn joy sedum in the front there, very common landscape plant these days. And then eventually the garden's quite full and somewhat bursting at the seams. Another example, early on you see Russian sage, that purple plant, some sort of echinacea cultivar down in the bottom, and then that reed canary grass I mentioned. These are all extremely popular non-native plants. Tough to kill, but they don't support pollinators like we're hoping to do with the plantings these days. And then over time, these landscapes peter out as well. So, you know, 15 years later, 13 years later, the plants are petering out in this particular garden, require a lot of replacement. Here's a more naturalized example. 2004, the landscape was redesigned at Minnetonka City Hall. So this one, we took nature's model and tried to replicate it to some degree as best we could. So what you're seeing here are these tamarack trees and a variety of sedges in the bottom of this basin, sort of hinting at those northern tamarack bog landscapes that I showcased early. And then over time, you see those plants maturing and filling out to some degree. And eventually those tamaracks absolutely thriving in that garden to a point now where they've somewhat overcrowded themselves. And some of those trees have we've been losing some of those trees. And what has happened is the ground plane under them has really opened up quite a bit, thus allowing some weeds to get established in there. So the light regime went from sun to shade under those trees, and we need to reconsider the plantings underneath those particular trees. One thing to really keep in mind is that we're going to be facing increasing impacts from climate change in the coming years. So we're going to see more drought, more days over 90 degrees. We're going to see increased intensity of rainfall, where we're going to get approximately the same amount of rainfall, but decreased frequency. We're going to get potentially shorter winters with decreased snow cover and average winter temperatures. Soil drying, flash drought, this is all going to be a reality. So when you're thinking through plants, a lot of folks are recommending considering what we call assisted migration of plants from the south that would normally be thriving in, let's say, Iowa or even further south. What you're seeing here is a map of the changing hardiness zones. So every plant has a designated hardiness zone. Typically in our area, we're zone 4. What you're seeing is those warmer temperatures and those warmer zones moving up into Minnesota. So the top part of that map shows our region as having essentially a +1 zone change over the last 25 years featured in these two particular maps. So the reality of stresses on our particular plants is coming to fruition, and we're seeing more and more an impact on delicate plants that need that cold in the winter or can't survive that extreme condition of drought in the summer. So I want to highlight a handful of native species that survive these extreme conditions in gardens. And I'm going to reference a couple plant lists at the end of this, so no need to write all these down, and we'll have resources available for folks to go through. One I really like to highlight is tussock sedge. This is perfect in the bottom of basins. It also thrives in less dry locations where essentially it's able to sit in the water and form these tussocks, these mounds to some degree. Beautiful plant, spreads around, can crawl up the side of the banks of a rain garden or shoreline buffer. Here it is used at the Minnetonka City Hall site. You can see it really thriving when it had the full sun. Needs that full sun condition, certainly. Palm sedge is another native sedge, similar to tussock or lake sedge. Has a slightly different form, but also very full, fairly inexpensive to get from our native plant producers these days. Palm sedge is one I recommend to plant in sort of a large massing where you'd get a lot of it growing all at once. That would be similar to this plant I highlighted earlier, prairie cordgrass. This is in Maplewood. This is a larger infiltration basin. So typically what would have been here is a stormwater pond. So there would have been an open pond, but instead we planted it essentially with a model of this northern tamarack bog ecosystem with prairie cordgrass and some other sedge species in there, and then a mix of tamaracks as well. But we're able to sort of accomplish some habitat creation, some soil building while we're dealing with the stormwater runoff from this particular street. I really want to highlight swamp milkweed, extremely important pollinator species, as well as all the other milkweed species. This one works perfectly well in the suburban landscape. It blooms for a really long time. It's very tough to kill. It is prone to deer and rabbit browse, so some protection is necessary. And then in the foreground, you're seeing some of the native blue flag iris. Very interesting foliage, long bloom times, right in the spring when you want to see them. Very beautiful native plant. Showcasing just a handful of cultivars, namely the switchgrass cultivars. Switchgrass is a very drought-tolerant, deep-rooted native perennial. In its native form, it's spectacular, but there are some cultivars available, which I'd recommend for tough locations like this boulevard that you're seeing here. This particular cultivar is called heavy metal because it has sort of a steely blue color to it. So it's an option. You'll see it at hardware stores and Home Depot and other places if you have a location that maybe gets some salt spray from the road or other salt in the runoff where or tight soils or extreme drought conditions. Talking about shrubs and woody species, I really like to recommend winterberry. This particular species, you need the two versions of it. So there's a male and a female version, and you need both of them to produce the berries on these plants yearly. These berries are delicacies of our native birds, songbirds. So beautiful background plant, takes up a lot of space in the garden. Would be perfect along the edges of a shoreline buffer, perhaps. But beautiful, glossy black foliage and overall great native plant. Same can be said about black chokeberry. It's similar to winterberry, glossy leaf, about head high at most in perfect conditions, but a bit of a space filler in terms of a woody shrub, native shrub. A lower native shrub that I like to highlight is called low bush honeysuckle. This is a native plant. If you've ever been to the Boundary Waters, you'll see this growing under the pine trees up there, the spruce and the pines up there. Very tough plant, can thrive in sun and shade conditions. Not much for flowers, but it does produce a small yellow flower, and it's just extremely hard to kill overall. Another native flowering plant that I really like to promote is Joe Pieweed. Generally, this plant is quite tall or can get quite tall. There are some cultivars available. There's one called Little Joe, which is slightly smaller, but the native one is perfectly appropriate in larger gardens or shoreline buffers where a little height is acceptable. A lower growing plant would be this Canada anemone. This is a beautiful little flowering plant, grows in fairly thick mats and works well in a large massing. And selecting for buffers, you're going to want to think through the various zones. So including the upland area, the driest portion of your buffer, what's called the transitional area, which would be the location where sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's wet, but generally those plants have their feet wet. And then the ones right at the aquatic edge. This image that you see here was grabbed right from 9 Mile's website, so they have a lot of amazing resources. A second resource that they have, and I mentioned this, spectacular plant lists. So I would imagine that Riley Purgatory has something similar, but 9 Mile has these beautiful plant lists to help you select and look through your options in terms of rain garden plants and shoreline buffer plants. I would also advise folks to go to the various native plant producers. Minnesota Native Landscapes or Prairie Moon Nursery have wonderful plant lists these days, and even particular seed mixes to help think through what would be possible, and other guidance for rain gardens and shoreline buffers overall. So there's really a ton of amazing resources, and the community has really grown in this capacity, where it wasn't but 15 years ago, it was hard to find these particular native plants locally. But more and more you're able to find these plants themselves and all the information needed to make the appropriate choices on what to use. So I know I threw a lot at you quickly, but that's the end of my show here. I'm more than happy to answer questions or bring back up images on the slide as necessary, talk through people's particular projects or whatever would be useful.
Great, thanks, Matt. That was a lot of good information. We haven't had any questions come through the chat yet, but while you folks are thinking of those, you can certainly feel free to turn your videos back on or use the raise hand feature or just put them in the chat. But while that is happening, I also wanted to mention that there's a great program called Lawns to Legumes, and they also have some amazing plant lists as well as templates for gardens, which I have found very useful as a coach for that program. So this is hosted through the Board of Water and Soil Resources, but also through Metro Blooms. And through both of those two websites, they have a lot of different resources for people who are getting started in these sorts of pollinator gardens.
It can be very intimidating to start this sort of thinking and design process. So I think your point's well taken, and I try to stress that there's a lot of wonderful resources and folks itching to help.
I will jump in and remind folks, if you live in the city of Minnetonka, that we have an annual native plant sale that can help to offset some of the cost of this. We have some technical assistance programs, so that's why I provided those links for following our our electronic and print newsletters, because that's where we inform folks about that. And then, Matt, I thought I'd start with a question some folks might not have thought of or might not know how to ask. If you are preparing a site for a buffer or a rain garden, and you've got to get rid of what was already there, are there some ways to do that that don't involve a lot of herbicide use?
Yes, absolutely. So good question. That's often the challenge. So turf grass is often what's needing to be removed. So there are some natural options to eradicate that turf grass. So for instance, I'm seeing folks have success laying down layers of cardboard and or newspaper, and then putting mulch on top of that to essentially smother the grass over time. This can be very effective, but you're needing a lot of material to do that. The other option would be physically removing the sod itself. So I've done this in my yard. You can rent what's called a sod kicker, essentially a blade that can cut up the top layer of the sod enough to eradicate it. You're left with essentially a rolled piece of sod that can then be gotten rid of. But either of those methods are physical labor and produce a lot of stuff that you need to get rid of, either the mulch or the cardboard or the physical sod itself. So it's a bit physically intimidating, I would say, to physically remove it like that. So that would be what you need to do if you were looking to avoid herbicides.
Great, thanks for that information. I'm hoping that the chat feature works. I did try and change things up, so hopefully it's working for you to submit questions through the chat. One thing that I was wondering here, Matt, is when you're doing soil amendments, could you talk a little bit more about that? How do you know if your soil needs amendments? What do you put in? How do you mix it? That sort of thing.
Yep, good question. I really stress the importance of soil health, and unfortunately, we are often faced with soils that are less ideal. I would say we live in a very changeable landscape in terms of soil. We can have a block away, your neighbor can have heavy clays, and you could be up on a hill with sandy gravel. So just being generally aware of what you have. But if you come to a situation where you feel like you need to amend the soil, thus make it looser or make it better for plant health, there's a series of things you can do, such as tilling the soil and incorporating compost or other sort of sandier, leaner soils. If you have a clay type material, trying to decompact it as deep as you possibly can and reintroduce those nutrients through a compost, for instance. And there are several compost sites in the Twin Cities, or you could buy the bag stuff and incorporate that. You can also add things like fungal inoculants or compost tea, they call it, which would sort of jumpstart the natural process of growing those fungal communities in your soil, which are essential for quality plant growth.
Right. We have a question here from the chat. It says, I have a V cut in my curb that was installed years ago to drain trench into the street. Depending upon grade, is there any likelihood that this could also serve to bring water from the street into a rain garden?
Yeah, potentially. Depending on grade, you're thinking about it the right way. So you could, if there is essentially runoff coming from your yard into the street, it sounds like you could create a depression there for a rain garden. And overflow would then leave, or vice versa. It could come from the street into this particular depression. You're going to really want to be sure of the soils there. So the last case scenario, you'd want to create a depression that would just hold water all the time. Mosquito concerns, stinky and ugly, all those sort of things. So you'd need to be thoughtful about those subsoils, but it sounds like it could be worth investigating.
I wanted to point out that in our communications about this workshop, I did include a few links, some of the things we might have already, the grant information and whatnot, we might have already talked about at the beginning. And there are 2 video links. One is a rain garden maintenance video that we collaborated on a couple of years ago that could give you kind of a reality check of what's involved, not just in the installation, but the long term, because Matt really made it clear this isn't a one and done. This is a maintained area. There's no unmaintained plantings in a suburban area like ours. You do it, and then you have to see how to take care of it to make sure, in the case of a rain garden, that it remains functional, but also that it just doesn't get messy. And there's a separate Shoreline video from maybe Washington, Ramsey, Washington. But those are both really good ways for you to get a sense of what some of this stuff beyond what Matt has talked about so well. And then I also really am so glad that Matt pointed out about milkweed. One really crucial thing we want to think about is not just pollinator benefit, but some of our most vulnerable pollinators. And those would be particularly monarch butterflies, which cannot survive without milkweed, because that's the plant that their caterpillars have to eat. Their whole life cycle really begins on milkweed. And then, rusty patch bumblebees, which have been seen in parts of Minnetonka. I get them in my own yard every year, often on that Joe Pie. And there's some other what we might call superfood plants that you might look into and consider for your plantings, because they offer either very high energy or very high nutrition for monarchs and pollinators. And monarchs and rusty patch bumblebees are both generalist pollinators, which means they will hit on the adults will hit on a lot of different nectar plants. And if you're feeding them successfully, then you are also, by extension, feeding lots of other pollinators. So that's taking it in kind of a different direction from the functionality of a rain garden or a buffer. And I'll toss one other thing out. If you're considering a buffer, well, two things. One is a buffer will actually deter geese. So if you're having problems with geese in your lawn, a buffer makes them nervous because they can't see what's beyond it. And I forgot the other thing. Maybe I'll think of it.
Well,
anyway, thanks for letting me
have...
go off on some tangents. But
yeah, we do have a couple more questions popping in through the chat, so I'll read those for Matt here right now. I noticed the curbs were altered for the rain gardens featured. Do cities help with this, or does the homeowner need permission to alter the curb?
Yeah, good question. And it's different city to city, but typically you would need permission from the city to alter the curb. I know that's the case in Minnetonka, at least. So when cost share applicants come through, they do end up sending an email over to our engineering department, and they get permission to cut the curb to lower it for an inlet feature. So you're going to want to proceed cautiously. Typically, all partner cities are supportive of this idea. They just like the heads up. But generally, you can do it yourself or hire a contractor, potentially do it, and have the city come in and take a look after the fact. But you're going to want to go through the proper channels to make sure you're doing it appropriately, and they're not mad that their curb's cut all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. And some cities will also tie that into street reconstruction projects as well. So if they're doing new pavement, or if they need to do work on that street, they will go around to the homeowners on that street and ask if you would like a rain garden. I'm not sure what cities are doing that right now, but that has been the mode in the past.
Yep. And Minnetonka is doing that. We have a program through our street reconstruction process where folks can sign up to host the garden.
Cool. A couple people on this call are working together on a project. Jill and her mother Mimi in this seminar have been working on a steep hill at their cabin. There's about 3 feet of riprap rock that they're working above, and digging out what is there isn't really an option. We've tried many things without success, they say. Milkweed grows wild there, and we tried to plant more with seed packets and from seeds from the Discovery Point seed box. Hey, thanks. Little seed library, come check it out. Any tips on this type of aggressive landscape?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Honestly, I would look very seriously at getting a established buffer going with sedges and grasses before you try to introduce a lot of delicate forbs, like milkweed.
Forbs being flowers.
Flowering plants. Yep. So preparing the soil appropriately above the riprap, and sowing heavily seeds for a variety of deep-rooted native grasses. And then once that establishes in a year or two, introducing the forbs via plugs or small live plants rather than trying to seed that in. The often tall grasses, native grasses, sort of protect those delicate flowering plants. So I would focus on establishing some appropriate sedges and grasses before you go ahead and try to introduce the forbs.
And Matt also mentioned the sedges that are at Minnetonka City Hall. And I believe those are up around the top of City Hall. So not right when you drive in, but you kind of follow the road around a little bit.
Correct. Yeah, back
okay.
towards the bigger parking lot by the new police and fire building.
Okay, yeah. You can also check out the tussock sedge in particular at 9 Mile Creek Discovery Point, which is where the little seed library is that Jill mentioned. Of course, now it's winter, but in the spring and summer, they form a really beautiful sort of wavy mat, for lack of a better word, or wavy prairie looking thing in the bottom of the rain garden. And so they are definitely easy to weed and they look beautiful. So.
And, I'm very familiar with that site. I designed that rain garden. It's extremely sandy there. So the 9 miles off the site is a sandy gravel glacial outwash site, and the water infiltrates quickly, I'm sure. So tussock sedge, although a wetland plant, is able to thrive in those very sandy, typically dry soils.
Another question here in the chat, is there a lower maintenance rain garden?
So lower maintenance rain garden would mean, frankly, planning the planting appropriately for, let's say, less diversity. So you'd have the bottom of the rain garden would be 1 or 2 grass or sedge species. The edges would be a handful of tough natives, flowering plants, and keeping the plant palette relatively simple. So planting in masses. So things like tussock sedge at the bottom, but rather than 1 or 2 plants, you plant the whole bottom with, let's say, 20 of them. So it forms a very dense mat. That would keep your maintenance efforts down by combating new weeds coming in, and also making it easier to spot those weeds when they do come in. So not having to try to pick out what's native or what's a weed, keeping the planting nice and simple, mulching heavily right off the bat and maintaining that mulch. That would be really the most effective way to lower the amount of maintenance as much as possible.
Great. An addendum to that question is, are there any information on contractors in the resources? And I might jump in really quick on answering that question. Especially as watershed districts, we can't say that one company is better over another, but we do have a list of contractors that do this sort of work that you could start with. So Christina is going to be sending out the video link for this recording, as well as the links that were posted in the chat. And I can certainly send that list of contractors along as well to be included in that email. But Matt, Christina, Eleanor, I don't know if you guys want to jump in on that too.
And I would say there are a lot of contractors doing this work. I would look for contractors off the list that'll be sent out, but we can't specifically say hire this person or not this person. But make sure that their portfolio showcases successful features like the ones you're asking for. We're seeing a little bit of greenwashing in the landscape industry these days with folks who say, yeah, of course we can do that, and don't know some of the particulars, some of the, the things that really make them shine or can cause them to fail. So you'll want to look for a contractor that doesn't just say they can do it, but show pictures or project examples.
And I'll add to that, I believe that the organization Blue Thumb, whose focus is planting for clean water, has resources of that kind on their website. I think it's just bluethumb.org. And the Lawns to Legumes website is more than just the grant that's available. It has a tremendous number of resources and education, so that even if you weren't to get a grant, you could learn a lot just by really diving in and exploring that. And you may find, for example, that a rain garden is not the right option for your site. And that, just remember what I was going to say about buffers, which is that buffers are well placed alongside wetlands. In addition to lakes and streams, there's lots of emphasis, but Minnetonka has more than 800 wetlands of all different kinds and sizes, and buffers are good for that. But anyway, you may find that a buffer or a rain garden is not the right thing for you in terms of your space or what you can put into it. But you may find that a pocket planting or a meadow or some other feature is a good way to bring in some of the benefits without going as far as a rain garden or a buffer. Yeah, so and Blue Thumb and Lawn Legumes should have a contractor list.
So the next question here in the chat is, what is the best way to clear raspberry canes from the soil where I want to plant?
Yeah, well, raspberry, it's a pretty aggressive plant. It's hard to kill. You're going to need to dig those out, frankly. Your options would be to physically remove the plant as much as you can. My house came with a very large raspberry patch, and I was successful at finding and chasing them and digging them out. The only other option would be to cut and treat them with an herbicide, and the plant would bring that herbicide down into the soil and kill it. But physically digging and removing them, cutting them back year in year, it won't eradicate them. You need to physically dig the stumps out.
It can be tough with all the thorns and spikes.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
Matt, can you treat those stumps as you would a buckthorn stump using a dauber?
Yes, you can treat the stump. So, the raspberry combs, a bunch of them will die each year. So some of them are going to be gray and dried out. But a living one can be cut and herbicide applied to the stump. This would be a similar application as what we do to eradicate buckthorn, the woody invasive species. Carefully formulated mix of herbicide and a dye could be applied to that stump late in the fall or early in the spring, and that herbicide would be drawn into the plant. And it's a very sensitive way to use herbicide, where you really don't need to spray it on the foliage, and you don't need to risk overspray or affecting things that you don't want to. So that would be an option too. There's plenty of resources in terms of using herbicide to stump treat plants.
What other questions are out there? We've come to the end of the questions in the chat.
Can I toss a question out to our participants to let us know either right now in the chat or unmute and turn your video on and ask a question or answer the question, or respond when I send out the email resources. I'd love to know what else you need in terms of information, technical assistance, what would make these efforts more accessible to you? And you can think about that and get back to us, because you'll, like Gail said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email, and happy to hear from you after that.
Yeah, we really want to make sure this is as targeted towards what you're trying to accomplish as possible. So, we represent our organizations, and we're resources to make sure everybody's getting what they need and feeling properly encouraged and emboldened to take on these projects.
I'm watching the chat and there are no responses coming through yet, so people might need to think about that and plan out their projects a little bit more. Testing soil. That's a great question. How to test the soil.
Yeah, so I know the University of Minnesota, you can take soil samples. They have an online form that you can fill out to essentially collect a sample and send that in to a testing lab at the St. Paul campus, I believe. And for a nominal fee, it's like $20 or something. They test your soil, but predominantly what they're looking for are nutrient values as if you were growing a vegetable garden. So you can get some information that way, but otherwise you can test soil by digging into it and getting a feel for essentially what it looks like, what colors it is, whether or not you can crush it into a ball and it stays that way. I didn't get into the particulars of soil analysis, but there's research or lots of resources online to get a sense if your soil is more clay or more silt or more sand and everywhere in between, and then the various colors that you would expect to see based on the health of the soil. Dark is generally more rich, but red and yellow is generally more lean. So you can get physical tests done. You can also buy tests from like Home Depot and stuff, I believe, and test for simple nutrient values. But in terms of permeability, if you're planting a rain garden, for instance, best way to do it is to dig a hole and pour some water into it and see what you got. You would want to get to a point where that would be the potential bottom of your rain garden. So digging beneath those topsoils, but that would be a way to test permeability, pour water in and make sure that that water soaks in within 24 to 48 hours or so.
Jill says, I appreciate the question, Christine. Are we able to contact any of the presenters in the future with questions once we have them?
Absolutely. We are here for you. You should find out what watershed district you're in. If you don't already know, all you have to do is go to any of the watershed districts, and there's always a map feature that says, are you in the watershed? You put in your address and it'll tell you what watershed district you're in. The link to the natural resources page for the city of Minnetonka has our staff contacts for myself and Matt and our colleagues, and we'll make sure you have contact information for all of us as a follow-up.
We're always looking to talk to residents, be it, tree questions or general landscaping. We have lots of resources available for folks.
Yeah, and we are going to continue to offer probably more workshops next year, kind of trying to create a sequence that helps people think about a lot of these issues. And so do keep an eye out. Again, even if you don't live in the city, our e-newsletter comes out monthly and has resources, and almost without fail, you're able to attend our workshops, whether you live in the city or not. One other resource I do want to point out, Matt talked early on in the presentation about subsurface gas lines, cable lines, things like that. So before you do any digging, always make sure that you set up an appointment with Gopher State One Call. It's just call 811 or go online and set up an appointment. It's an easy thing, and it really helps you know what's there. You don't want any surprises. You don't want to accidentally hit a gas line or something.
It's totally free too. Maybe you mentioned that, Christine, but it's totally free.
Well, thank you everybody for your questions and your comments. There's an interesting one that just popped up here. A couple of people have had success with rose bushes on the wild hill that was mentioned earlier. They keep spreading. Why weren't roses mentioned in this seminar?
Well, perhaps the person is referring to our native shrub rose, which is a prairie species. I'm assuming that's the rose they're talking about, not the more decorative cut rose species, which
they said
are difficult to grow. So I'm assuming there's lots of drought tolerant, tough plants, our native shrub rose being potentially one of them. I couldn't get to all the wonderful species we have.
Yeah, there are a lot. Sure. Okay, well, thank you again, everybody, for all of your questions and comments. And we certainly hope to hear from you afterwards. And thanks, Matt, for a great presentation. There are lots of thank yous rolling in the chat right now. So appreciate that. If you have any other questions or comments, feel free to email us. We have all been copied on those emails that you've been getting about all the changes that have happened. So again, thank you. And Chris, Eleanor, Matt, any final words?
Just thanks to everybody. Thanks for listening.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks for joining us this evening.
Stay safe in the snow out there, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Take care.